Hey everybody, so today on Historical Perspective I thought I'd talk more about the War of 1812. I've already done two videos, one about the war, one about the peace, the impact of it and what it meant. And so as my friend the Historical Reader pointed out, my friend from YouTube Historical Reader pointed out, we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, which was the last major battle of the War of 1812. It took place January 7th, 1815. Of course, January 7th is right around the corner from where I'm shooting this, so hey, that's 200 years exactly from the War of 1812. Now, I studied this quite a bit in graduate school, the War of 1812, so naturally I have quite a few books. Here's one book by A.J. Lyeth, a historian from Southern California. We have Donald Hickey's book, which is one of my favorite books on the subject, especially if you don't feel you aren't that knowledgeable on the war. He's from right here in Nebraska, actually. And then we have British perspective. We have John Latimer's, I can't believe I had to look. I just looked like 5 seconds ago. John Latimer's book, 1812, War with America, which is a really good book. This is probably the most military of the books. This one has the most American perspective, good stuff in it. And Lyeth's is a very political work. He really goes deep into the politics of the War of 1812. They're all really good books, and so if you're really, really curious, there you go. There are books to read. But last night I picked up all three of these books in hopes of deciding what I want to talk about in terms of the Battle of New Orleans. Now, I've already talked about the aftermath of the battle. I've talked about the fact, in my previous two videos, I've talked about twice even, that when the treaty came down, so did news that the Americans had won the Battle of New Orleans. So Americans sort of associated the two things and felt like the United States had won the war. Won the Battle of New Orleans, got peace, so we won, right? Yeah, so I've already talked about that. So why don't we go into this? How did General Jackson and his Tennessee and Kentucky volunteers, along with a handful of local defenders there in New Orleans, so thoroughly rout General Pakenham's British forces? What happened that made this battle such a complete and utter rout? Because it's a big time rout. It's very, very few to almost no casualties on General Jackson's side, with a great many casualties on General Pakenham's side, including General Pakenham himself, who tried to rally the troops as the battle was falling apart and was shot and killed. Somewhat fortunately, some people have pointed out, as he may have been court-martialed for his just massive defeat at this battle. So how does this happen? How do the British forces, who had cruised through 1814, 1814 was a good year for the British forces in the War of 1812. They had largely won most of the battles they had fought, and the only battle they really hadn't won at that point was at Fort McHenry, just up the stream from Washington, D.C., where they had been turned back. Hadn't really lost, but tried to attack a defensive position and really didn't penetrate that defensive position, were forced back at that point. So how do they lose so badly here? Well, it's a combination of things. There was a British strategist named Cochrane who came up with a strategy of taking New Orleans and driving up through the Mississippi Valley, cutting off the United States from its newly acquired Louisiana Purchase, and just keeping them there on the East Coast and limiting their power, because the United States would be becoming a burgeoning threat to British possessions in the Americas, including especially Canada. During this very war, they had burned York, which was responded to by burning Washington, D.C. That was actually, Washington, D.C.'s burning was actually a response to the burning of York. And so the British were a little tired of the United States causing them trouble in their minds. So Cochrane came up with this plan. We take New Orleans and we shove up the Mississippi Valley, we connect that to Canada, and now the Americas are forced to sort of succumb and just be kind of trapped there on the East Coast. Now, his plan had a couple problems. He felt like the British could take this without a lot of troops. He felt like the people of New Orleans, who were still largely French and Creole from the times it was French possession, would be welcoming to the British, and he thought that really there wasn't much for defense there because the naval defense was poor, so he assumed that the military defense was poor as well. Well, he didn't count on General Jackson coming down with, 4,000 battle-hardened troops who had been fighting the Native Americans in the Black Hawk Wars and then several other small skirmishes during the War of 1812. So these were guys who were experienced fighters. They knew how battle took place, and they were all veterans. So veteran soldiers make a big difference, and these were veteran soldiers as opposed to the British force, which had some veterans in it but had a mix, also had some greener guys in it. But nobody had fought in New Orleans. Absolutely nobody. And New Orleans is very different. It's very swampy. There's not a lot of places in Europe that are like that area. And so the British were a little out of their element in New Orleans. So that's how you end up with the situation of the British and the Americans in the same positions. Now, from there, it gets really interesting how the battle becomes the rout that it does. Now, General Jackson was a smart guy. Andrew Jackson became President of the United States, and he was a smart guy. I have my historical problems with Andrew Jackson, but he wasn't a dummy, that's for sure, and he understood that the Americans had done very poorly in open field battle with the British. Traditionally in those days, armies lined up in columns and marched at each other and fired. Their muskets did volleys. You didn't dig trenches or get behind things. That was not considered a way to fight a war. The British thought it was very dishonorable. But General Jackson knew that when the Americans fought in this open style, they did really poorly. The British tended to rout them because it was their style of warfare. So he wasn't going to do that. He was going to dig a trench and build up earthworks and fire from behind to protect a position. And that's exactly what he did. He built a huge earthwork, and in front of it was this huge trench. So you had to climb 10, 15, 20 feet to even get up to the American position where they had not tanks, cannons. That'd be really an interesting anachronism. But had cannons and their muskets, and so they're from this very protected position while the British are coming down and up at them. Well, how did he know where to build the earthworks? How did he know that the British would come to that spot? Well, a combination of things: escaped prisoners, scouts, different things had led Jackson to pretty much figured out exactly where General Pakenham and the British forces would go. Spies and people were the French there. The French people there that had been under American rule now for about 10 years at this point really weren't all that excited about seeing the British there. And in fact, tended to kind of side with Jackson, the Americans, and they were not too dissatisfied telling Jackson exactly what the British were doing. And Pakenham, for better or worse, was fairly predictable. He wasn't familiar with the area. He had to take the safest path. He had to find the most local scouts he could, and some of them turned out to be spies for Jackson. Some of them would go scout for Pakenham and immediately turn around and tell Jackson exactly what they had told him and where to go. So it was really easy for Andrew Jackson to pick the battlefield. That's right. So Andrew Jackson got to pick the battlefield. And for those who know your military history, anytime one commander gets to pick the battlefield over the other, it's a huge advantage because you know everything that's going to happen. You know where everything's going to take place. You get to set everything up, and Jackson was there well before Pakenham, so he gets to build these huge earthworks. That became a huge problem. Furthermore, how this battle becomes a rout is when the British arrive. It's a really foggy, misty morning, and there's like a good mile stretch between where the British sort of become uncovered, where they come out of there's like forests and trees and stuff, and this is really open plain in the middle. And there's a mile between there and the earthworks where the American position is. There's so you're running a full mile of being exposed. And this morning that they arrived, it was really misty and foggy, and fog was sort of settling in the low-lying areas. Now the British are still in those low-lying areas, so they can't really see the earthworks. They know, they've heard they're there. They've got just enough scouting to know that that's about where the Americans are. But they don't know this for sure. They're kind of guessing and sort of probing around in this misty morning. While the Americans, of course, are sitting up high. And guess what? When you're sitting up high, you can see much better. They can sort of see through the fog, and they know, here come the British. We can see them coming in. They're coming at us very blindly. And so the British rush this position. And as I said, the earthworks, so now they're trying to come up. These earthworks, while the Americans are firing down on them with grape shot, you put a tin in a cannon, you fire it, just scattered like a shotgun everywhere. And of course, musket fire and everything just raining down on the British, trying to cover this full mile before they even get the earthworks. And here's the thing that actually makes this battle extremely ugly, is the British didn't bring ladders. If you're going to do siege warfare of a wall, you better have ladders. They actually had ladders with them. They had literally just forgotten the ladders. They forgot to bring them with them to the front. And so they get to this wall, and they have no way of climbing up the wall. They're standing at the bottom of the wall being peppered down on by American forces. They are just being hammered. They begin to actually stack up the dead in an attempt to get up this wall. And of course, at this point, Pakenham rides forward and tries to run. They try to get the ladders up there, but it's all too little too late. The rout is already on. The Americans have smothered the British with fire over this mile stretch at the bottom of this wall, and their dead are stacking up, and they do the only thing they can do at this point, which is turn tail and run, because they were beat. They were beat by intelligence. They were beat by the land. They were beat by timing. They were beat by everything at this point. They got out strategized. Andrew Jackson, and yeah, he got a little lucky by having his right in the right place. Of course, he'd used intelligence and stuff like that, but had Pakenham been a little better commander, maybe he'd had the foresight to flank around Jackson rather than attacking him head on. But he wasn't. And so this is how this battle becomes a massive rout. It's just one commander really planning, preparing, and knowing his territory, as opposed to another commander, General Pakenham, being fairly unsure of himself in the area. Another thing to remember about Pakenham is he was actually fighting, his brother was the Duke of Wellington, who had won the battle, who ended up winning the Battle of Waterloo, who was the British commander. And so he had been with him until December of 1814. He did not arrive in the Louisiana area until late December. He had only been in the area for a couple of weeks when the battle took place. So not only is he in unfamiliar territory, he hasn't even been there long enough to really establish any sort of base in the area. Pakenham was at every disadvantage in the world. And being routed really isn't a surprise when you consider it. And Cochrane's strategy that I talked about earlier really set him in a bad position where he was told he had to take New Orleans. So he couldn't do anything but fight, even though he wasn't prepared, didn't know the area, wasn't in a good command position, and of course he was routed. That shouldn't be a surprise when you consider it. General Jackson, of course, came out and celebrated. He was praised throughout the land, would eventually become president. Pakenham was a little bit infamous in British military history for a while, although he's been redeemed a little bit. And Latimer actually, about Latimer's book, he talks about a little bit how, it wasn't so much Pakenham's fault. And the Duke of Wellington was actually irate at the time. This was his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law was killed in a battle. So there you have it. There's the Battle of New Orleans, and I hope that explains to you why it was such a rout and why it was what it was. And I hope it gives you a little historical perspective.